On September 21st, 1943, at 09:27 in the morning, outside Salerno, Italy, a 19-year-old private lay on an operating table with a wound he should have survived and a problem he couldn't. He didn't run out of luck. He didn't run out of medicine. He ran out of blood. 10 minutes before the next truck, full of life-saving supplies, was due to arrive, his heart simply had nothing left to pump. Lieutenant Emily Ward had both hands inside his chest when it happened. The tent smelled of iodine, wet canvas, and metal. Not the clean, sharp metal of instruments. The heavy copper smell of someone's son leaking out faster than she could push it back in. More pressure, the surgeon said without looking up. "I'm already in his aorta," Emily snapped. "He doesn't need pressure. He needs volume." They'd given him everything the system recognized as blood. One bottle of dried plasma dissolved in water that tasted faintly of chlorine and canvas. One hard-won unit of stored whole blood, type O. The last bottle in the refrigerator, humming stubbornly at the far end of the tent. The boy's name was Carter. She only knew because his dog tags kept clinking against her wrist every time she shifted her hands to chase his fading pulse. Carter Opos. His skin had gone from olive to paper. Under her palms, his heart fluttered, frantic and useless, trying to push a river that had turned into a puddle. "Any more O?" she said, without taking her eyes off the field of red and gauze. The orderly didn't even look at the fridge. He already knew. "That was it, ma'am. We're dry. Next resupply? Convoy from Naples, tomorrow morning. If the roads hold, if the trucks make it. Tomorrow morning." Carter's pulse shivered like a trapped bird. "Lieutenant," the surgeon murmured, voice going soft in that way she hated, "we've done what we can." Emily's jaw clenched. What we can? 3 cots away, 3 walking, breathing soldiers watched with the blank, exhausted eyes of men who had seen too many others on that table. Private Jones, A positive, Corporal Hennessy, O negative, Sergeant Lopez, B positive. She knew their types without checking. She had written them herself, in small, neat letters in the margin of their charts. Between those 3 men alone, there were more than 15 units of compatible blood sitting upright, smoking, complaining about rations. 15 pints the inventory didn't count. 15 pints the regulations treated as untouchable, because the system only recognized blood if it arrived in glass bottles from somewhere far away and safe. At 09:37, Carter's heartbeat stuttered under her fingers and stopped. The surgeon stepped back, pulling off his gloves with a snap that sounded too loud in the sudden quiet. Time of death, 09:37. Emily didn't move. Her own gloves dripped onto the floor in slow, obscene beats. What we can. We had 3 full tanks within arm's reach, and we watched him run dry. Before the war, she had believed in systems. Hospitals love students like her. Precise, organized, never needed to be told anything twice. In training, they had shown her the miracle of modern transfusion medicine like a magic trick that finally worked. ABO groups, RH factors, cross-matching. Charts that turned blood into letters and pluses and minuses instead of superstition and guesswork. This, a lecturer had said, tapping a clean glass bottle with a gloved finger, is what separates us from the butchers of the last war. In the demonstration, a pale man on a clean bed had pinked up in minutes while students watched the red stream slide through clear tubing. You didn't just watch someone fade anymore. You reached into a refrigerator, grabbed life by the neck, and poured it in. That was the theory. Then they put her in olive drab, put the refrigerator on the back of a truck, and put the truck 2 hours behind the men who were doing the bleeding. The Army's blood doctrine sounded sensible if you read it in an office. Blood came from home. From donors bled in bright rooms, their gifts spun and tested and filtered, poured into thick glass bottles under fluorescent lights. Those bottles went into refrigerated trucks. The trucks went onto ships. The ships went to depots. The depots sent them forward. At every step, somebody signed something. By the time those pints reached a field hospital like the one outside Salerno, they had survived more bureaucracy than most privates. Once there, the manual said, the blood belonged in a refrigerator, safely to the rear, at a recommended distance from the front lines to minimize risk of loss due to enemy action. The manual did not say where to keep the 19-year-olds, so the pints stayed in their humming metal box, safe from shellfire and shrapnel. The bleeding men came to her table, not safe at all. If the roads were good, and the Luftwaffe was somewhere else, and no staff officer reprioritized the convoy, the fridge filled up. If any of those things went wrong, the fridge stayed empty, and the operating table became a place where you learned how far you could stretch a single unit and a prayer. To the system, whole blood was a commodity like fuel or artillery shells. It moved on schedules and manifests. It was counted in tonnage and ton miles. And like shells, there were clear lines on maps beyond which you were not supposed to push it. Nowhere in any of those memoranda did anyone write down the stupidly obvious thing Emily could no longer unsee. The front line was made of walking blood, platoons, companies, entire battalions of men with dog tags that already announced, in stamped steel, what they could safely give and who they could safely save. Every squad was a rolling, swearing, smoking blood bank that nobody had bothered to tap. 3 nights after Carter died, the tent was too quiet. Quiet in a field hospital did not mean peace. It meant something was delayed, or something had gone wrong far enough away that the ambulances hadn't yet caught up to it. Emily sat at the nurse's table with a roster spread out in front of her, the corners soft from folding. The Army had printed the names and serial numbers. The rest of the ink was hers. In the margin, 3 columns she wasn't supposed to have made: A, B, O, plus, and minus. Every time a man passed through her tent, she checked the blood type stamped on his tags against the little card in his medical packet, and, when they disagreed, against a drop of his actual blood on a plate. Sometimes the tags were right. Sometimes some bored clerk in a stateside processing center had misread a lab slip and turned a type A kid into an O, universal donor, that would quietly kill the wrong patient. She had already circled 2 of those mistakes in red. The system didn't just lose blood. Sometimes it lied about it. Now, in the weak yellow light of a lantern, she counted. In the battalion whose wounded they saw most, she'd personally handled just under 500 men. 210 were type O. Roughly half O positive, a precious handful O negative. Universal donors in truth, not just on misprinted tags. Most of them were not on cots. They were out there somewhere in the dark, swatting mosquitoes, writing bad letters home, and pretending not to be afraid. She turned the roster over and did the math on the back of a requisition form. 1 healthy adult can safely give a pint of blood every 6 weeks without much more than grumbling. 2, if you are careful and desperate. 200 O-types times 1 pint every 6 weeks. 300 extra units per month from 1 battalion if someone bothered to ask and to keep track. 300 bottles the trucks didn't have to bring. 300 carters who didn't have to run dry. She stared at the number until the ink blurred. A gust of cooler air slipped under the tent flap. Private Jones stood there with 2 steaming mugs and circles under his eyes. "Figured you'd still be up, ma'am," he said. "Can't sleep. Keep hearing that kid's dog tags." She took the nearer mug. "Thank you, Jones." He glanced down at the paper. "All that just for types?" "All that just for types," she said. "You're A positive. Hennessy's O neg. Lopez is B pos. Between the 3 of you, you were carrying more blood than our entire fridge when Carter came in." Jones flinched. "Then why didn't we—" He couldn't finish it. "Because the manual says direct fresh whole blood transfusions are for base hospitals only. Because the colonel is more afraid of being the first man court-martialed for unauthorized procedure than he is of reading one more letter over a body. Because the last time somebody improvised in the wrong way, they used a bad match and the story spread all through the Corps, and nobody ever told the quiet stories where it worked. Because nobody told you were allowed," she said. He stared at his own tags, thumb rubbing the raised letters. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that if you'd walked in there and asked for volunteers, we could have kept him going?" "We could have bought him time," she said. "Enough to see if the surgeons could do their part. Enough to see morning." "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, "next time, ask. We're not made of glass. Better we walk around a little lightheaded than carry another set of tags back in a sock." He hesitated. "Why stamp our types on here?" he added, tapping the metal at his throat, "if the only people who use it are the ones bagging the bodies?" Emily looked at the tiny rectangle of steel. Jones, a post-Catholic. 3 facts. 2, the chaplain cared about. 1, the system did not. "Because the Army loves information," she said, "as long as it doesn't have to change anything because of it." He gave a short, humorless laugh, saluted her with the mug, and disappeared back into the dark. She sat alone again, with her roster and her numbers, and the echo of Carter's tags in the bucket. Somewhere along the line, believing in systems had stopped being comfort and started feeling like complicity. The first time she broke the rules, it didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like triage. The ambulance rolled up at 0217 with 3 men in the back, and the kind of silence that meant the driver had run out of swear words halfway in. One was dead before they got him off the stretcher. One had a leg the surgeon took off in 8 minutes, a race between skill and shock that ended with the leg in a tray and the man breathing, barely. The third had a belly wound that could go either way. If she could keep enough blood inside him for an hour, he had a chance. If she couldn't, he'd be as dead as Carter before the sky thought about getting light. He was A positive. The refrigerator was humming and empty. The logbook said the next delivery was en route. En route might as well have been on the moon. Outside, under thin blankets in the recovery tent, 12 men slept and snored and muttered in their dreams. 6 A positive. 3 O negative. 3 O positive. Emily did not walk to the refrigerator. She walked to the flap and pushed it aside. For 3 seconds she stood there, looking at the slow rise and fall of chests, the row of boots under cots, the faint glint of dog tags swinging from nail heads. Then she flicked on the low lantern and let the decision leave her mouth before fear could haul it back. Who here is A positive and feels like saving somebody's life? They surfaced from sleep like men drowning. A couple cursed. One laughed, disbelieving. 3 hands went up. "Ma'am?" You and you," she said, moving fast, tapping tags. "On your feet. Slippers on. Nobody faints on my floor. If you do, I stick you twice just for the paperwork." They shuffled after her, wrapped in blankets and bravado. In the prep area, she snapped at the orderly. "Direct transfusion rig. Now." "Ma'am, that's not—" "Now," she repeated. "We cross-match properly, and we do it by the book. The right book, not the comfortable one. Or you can go out there and tell his squad you watched him die next to 3 full tanks." He went. They did the old-fashioned medicine the new doctrine had buried under glass and distance. 4 drops of blood on a white tile. Donor A, donor B, donor C, patient. Anti-A, anti-B. A practiced eye looking for clumping. No clumping. No ugly surprises. "On the table," she told the first donor. "Left arm. Look at the ceiling, not the needle. If you start to see angels, tell me. I prefer to meet them standing up." He tried to joke and failed. She slid the needle in. Dark red flowed through clear tubing, across a small distance that suddenly felt like the widest gap in the war, and into the pale vein in the unconscious man's arm. On the cuff, the blood pressure stopped falling. On her fingers, his pulse thickened from thread to string. The surgeon never paused his work, but she saw his shoulders loosen a fraction. 25 minutes later, all 3 donors were a shade too gray and very pleased with themselves, sipping sweet tea and making terrible jokes about owing him one. The patient was still here. Not pink, not safe, but here. Alive, for the moment, on other men's pints. When the surgeon finally stepped back, he pulled his mask down and said, grudging and honest, "All right, Lieutenant, I'll take the chewing out. You can keep the man." Emily peeled off her gloves. There would be forms. There might be shouting. There might be a line in a report somewhere about unauthorized use of locally available blood products. But there would not be another line on the roster under Carter's name. For the first time since Salerno, that felt like something that outweighed the weight of the rules. The official reprimand came 2 days later, typed on a form that had never seen mud. The battalion medical officer sat behind a crate he pretended was a desk. "Lieutenant Ward," he began, "did you authorize a direct fresh whole blood transfusion in the absence of adequate stored supplies?" "Yes, sir." "You are aware such procedures are discouraged at this echelon due to the risks of mismatching, contamination, and—" "I am aware," she said evenly, "that he is alive. And I am aware that Carter isn't." He opened his mouth to lecture, then noticed the roster she'd put on the crate between them. Names, serial numbers, corrected blood types, small pencil marks by men who had already donated once, little notes. Tolerated well, gets dizzy, used last, strong, good veins. "What is this?" he demanded. "The part of the blood bank the trucks don't carry," she said. "You've been compiling this?" "Yes, sir." "For how long?" "Since Tunisia." "Why?" "Because somebody had to. Because she couldn't unhear dog tags hitting a bucket. Because the system only counted blood once it was cold and anonymous, not while it was warm and smoking and writing home. Because it saves time," she said aloud. "If I know I have 6 O negatives within 10 minutes walk, I don't have to stand by an empty fridge and pretend we're helpless." He stared at the sheet for a long moment, jaw working. "You are playing with fire," he said finally. "No, sir," Emily replied. "We're standing in the middle of a fire. I'm just trying to stop pouring gasoline on it and call it protocol. For a second, she thought he'd explode. Instead, he rubbed the bridge of his nose and sighed. Unofficially, he said, that soldier owes you his life. Officially, you will record that you used locally available blood in an emergency. You will not circulate this list. You will not start a fashion for bleeding half the division in your tent. Is that understood? Yes, sir, she said. She walked out with the roster folded under her arm and her jaw set. Because buried in all the cautious phrases and covering language, she had just heard the only sentence that mattered. It works. Don't spread it. If the Army wasn't going to build the system she needed, she would. Not in memos, in whispers. Color dots on dog tags. Quiet deals with company commanders. A walking blood bank that could be at her tent flap in 3 minutes, with a shout and a stretcher, instead of in a truck 3 hours down a bombed-out road. Chapter 2 would be the story of the nights when that illegal network started humming so smoothly that surgeons stopped asking when the next convoy was due. Because, for the first time in the war, the blood they needed was already in the room. The first time the walking blood bank really lived up to its name. It was 3 in the morning, and the sky over the beach was the wrong color. Not black, not gray, orange. The Luftwaffe had found the landing craft. They heard the raid before they saw the stretchers. The field hospital sat just far enough inland that the noise usually arrived with a delay. A dull, distant thumping that meant someone else was having the worst night of their life, and the ambulances would bring the echoes later. This time, the sound was closer, faster, longer. The staff stepped outside on instinct. Over the low rise toward the sea, the horizon flickered. Bright bursts. Tracers like angry fireflies stitched the darkness. A ship's siren wailed and cut off. Somewhere, something big exploded and didn't stop for a long time. Jesus, one of the orderlies whispered. They're hitting the transports. Emily didn't waste time staring. How many empty tables? She said. 4 in the main tent, 2 in the overflow. How many units left in the fridge? The orderly gave her the look she already knew. Half a bottle of plasma, ma'am, and someone's lunch. So, nothing. The first ambulance rolled in 15 minutes later, brakes screaming, headlights blacked out, engine ticking as if it were afraid to turn off. When they pulled the rear doors open, the smell hit her first. Smoke, burnt cloth, burnt hair. Burns bled differently, slow and ooze-like. But under the char, she saw other things. Jagged metal, crushed limbs, the pale, waxy look of blood that had already left the useful places. Tag them, the surgeon barked. Airway, breathing, bleeding, burns. We take the ones we can turn around in under an hour first. Emily moved through the crush, hands on pulses, fingers lifting eyelids, mind already running a calculation she hadn't been taught in any classroom. How many pints do we need to get through the next hour? How many do we have in bottles? How many do we have on feet? She didn't go near the refrigerator. She went to the tent door and grabbed the nearest private by the sleeve. You from 3rd Battalion? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Good. Listen carefully. You are going to find Sergeant Davis in the recovery tent. You are going to tell him we've got a code Red Cross. You don't need to know what that means. He does. Go. He ran. Code Red Cross was not in any manual. It was a phrase she'd invented because yelling, "I need a positives who aren't about to fall over," took too long. Davis was her quietly recruited sergeant in 3rd Battalion. In 2nd, it was a corporal. In 1st, a chaplain who had decided that saving lives counted as an acceptable form of heresy. Each of them had the same thing tucked in their pocket that Emily did in hers, a folded sheet with names, units, and the most important two characters in the war stamped on dog tags. O, O+, A+. They were the core of her network. Men who had already donated once, tolerated it well, and had said, in one form or another, "Ma'am, if you need more, just holler." Tonight, she was going to holler. The ambulances came in waves. Burns, shrapnel, blast injuries from where men had been thrown against bulkheads. For some of them, no amount of blood would matter. For others, blood was the only thing that would. By the time the fourth Jeep ground to a halt, two of the operating tables were already slick with work, and one of the overflow cots held a young lieutenant with both legs broken and his lips turning the color of paper. "Ma'am," the orderly said in a low voice, "if we don't start something on him soon—" "I know," she said. The flap at the back of the tent lifted. Sergeant Davis ducked in, breathless, carrying a clipboard that wasn't his and a look that definitely was. "Got your message, Lieutenant," he said. "3rd Battalion's on standby. What's the draw?" She handed him a list she'd scribbled in the seconds between ambulances. 3 A positives, 3 O negatives, 4 O positives. The O negatives were for the unknowns, the men coming in too far, gone to wait for typing. "Fast as you can," she said. "Nobody more than 6 weeks out from their last donation." He nodded once and vanished. She didn't watch him go. She was already back at the tables, checking pulses, slapping cheeks, listening for the thin, ragged edge in a man's breath that meant his pressure was dropping through the floor. "Lieutenant," the surgeon called, "I'm going to need at least 2 units for this one, or we're wasting effort." "I'll get you 3, she said, hoping she wasn't lying. The donors arrived 8 minutes later. They didn't come on trucks. They came on their own legs. Some wore jackets hastily thrown over undershirts. Some had their sleeves half rolled. All of them had a small colored dot of paint on their dog tags, courtesy of Emily's quiet campaign over the last month. Red for O negative, blue for O positive, green for A positive. The paint was officially for quick identification in case of mass casualty. Unofficially, it was her way of making sure that if a runner needed a universal donor in the dark, he didn't have to squint at letters. Davis had 9 men with him. He looked almost offended he couldn't bring more. "You'll get them back," he said, "unless you break them." Emily didn't waste time on thanks. 3 for the big belly wound, she said, pointing. 2 for the kid on table 2. The rest stand by. Direct transfusion rig now. They moved. Needles, tubing. The familiar ugly miracle of one man's color flowing into another's. "Name?" she asked the first donor as he lay down. "Cooper, ma'am. Opos." "When did you last donate, Cooper?" "Couple weeks, maybe 3. Felt fine." "You'll feel less fine in about 10 minutes. Look at the ceiling, not at your arm. If you see 2 of me, tell me. If you see 4, that's too late." He snorted. Fear made bad jokes, but it kept him awake. She watched his blood start its journey. Watched the pallor in the belly-wounded lieutenant's face ease by a shade. Watched his pulse climb from a weak flutter to something that felt more like a heart and less like an apology. Around them, the storm of the raid kept echoing. Engines, bursts, distant shouts. In here, the war had shrunk to 2 arms and a line of glass. One of the O negatives went gray halfway through his pint. "Ma'am, I'm—" She was there with a hand on his shoulder before he could finish. Head down, she said. Knees up. Breathe. You're not dying. You're just being generous. He laughed weakly. Rather this than a letter, he mumbled. On the other table, the surgeon grunted. Pressure's holding, he said. I might actually get to finish this man. That's the idea, sir, Emily said. They worked like that for hours. Ambulances, donors, transfusions. Sometimes the donors came faster than the stretchers. Sometimes the stretchers outpaced the donors, and she had to make hard choices with clamps and tourniquets and the thin, cold reassurance of dried plasma when what she wanted was red. Once, near dawn, she almost made a mistake. A new batch of stretchers came in, men from a different unit they hadn't seen before. Their tags were stamped, their packets incomplete, their faces unfamiliar. She had 3 O negatives on her list, clean and rested. She sent for them, planning universal donor transfusions while they cross-matched properly. Then she saw one of the new arrivals' tags up close. Type O. Some tired clerk in some other depot's lab had mistyped him, or misstamped him, or simply not cared. She pricked his finger anyway. Habit now. On the tile, his O blood clumped angrily in anti-A serum. A positive. If she'd trusted the tag and the myth of universal donor without checking, she would have turned his veins into a battlefield. Her throat went dry. She adjusted, pulled one of her actual O negatives for him instead, and marked his name in big, angry letters on her roster. Tags wrong. A positive. Do not use as donor. That night, as she sat down for 5 minutes and her hands finally started to shake, she realized something that made her colder than the rain outside. The more the system trusted its own labels, the more lethal its mistakes were. Her ragged little network wasn't just saving pints. It was catching lies the war machine told itself. The numbers started to change quietly. Nobody announced it over loudspeakers. No general pinned a medal on a spreadsheet. But in the corners of the casualty reports, the language shifted. Where it used to say, died on table due to hemorrhagic shock, blood not available, it began to say, received fresh whole blood in field, survived to evacuation. The surgeons noticed first. They were not sentimental men. They didn't have the time. But they could count. Feels like I'm losing fewer on the table, one said, scrubbing his hands in a basin that had seen too much red. You are, Emily replied. You lost 4 out of 7 big bleeders last month. This month, you've lost 2 out of 9. He paused. How do you know that? I write it down. Of course you do, he muttered. He didn't argue, though, when she leaned over a new patient and called out, Type O neg donor, last donation over 6 weeks, who's free? Instead of, does supply have anything left? In a war where so much was random and vicious and stupid, the idea that you could brute force the odds with a roster and a few pints began to feel like heresy in the best possible way. Official recognition, when it finally came, did not look like recognition. It looked like a staff officer with clean boots and a notebook stepping into the tent one afternoon and saying in a neutral voice, Division wants an explanation, Lieutenant. Your outfit's got a noticeably higher rate of survive to evacuation on severe bleeds than other units in the sector. They'd like to know why. Emily wiped her hands and pointed to the fridge. We never run out, she said. The staffer raised an eyebrow. Really? She held his gaze for 2 heartbeats, then shook her head. No, not really. We run out of bottles all the time. We just stop pretending that's the only way to get blood to a vein. She laid her folded roster on the nearest flat surface. He read silently for a long moment. Names, types, dates of donation, tick marks, and shorthand comments. He was not a frontline doctor, but he wasn't stupid. "You're bleeding them in rotation," he said slowly. "You've essentially organized them." "Not essentially," she said. "Exactly. Twice a week, we have voluntary draws. We screen, we cross-match, we keep a reserve of donors we know tolerate it well. In mass casualty, we call them in directly. No trucks, no delays. It's not pretty, but it works," he finished. He looked uncomfortable saying it. "And what does your commanding officer think of this innovation?" "He thinks he signs fewer letters," she said. "Unofficially, of course." The staff officer hesitated. "You understand," he said, "that what you're doing is ahead of doctrine. There are liabilities, risks. If this goes wrong—" "If it goes wrong," she said quietly, "it will look exactly like it looks now in every place that isn't doing it. Men will bleed out while there are full tanks sleeping 3 tents away. I have already seen that version." He shut the notebook. "I'm not promising anything," he said, "but there's talk at corps level about formalizing walking blood banks for forward surgical units. Your numbers will help." "Is that what they're calling it?" she asked. "It sounds better than some nurse's crazy idea," he said. He left. He did not forbid her. He did not approve her. He simply took her grubby little ledger and fed it into a larger, cleaner machine. Months later, somewhere in an office, someone would type the phrase, "Frontline fresh whole blood programs have significantly reduced mortality from hemorrhagic shock. Recommend expansion and standardization." They would not type her name. She was fine with that. Names went on dog tags. Results went on graphs. By the time they moved north, her system was no longer a secret at all. New units rotated through and arrived with their own versions already sprouting. Lists on index cards, color codes on helmets, chaplains who knew which of their flock fainted at the sight of a needle and which could joke through a double donation. They called it different things. Bleeder Squad, Red Reserve, the Pint Platoon. The idea was the same. The blood you need is already here. You just have to have the courage and the bookkeeping to ask for it. One night, near the end of the Italian campaign, she walked through the recovery tent and caught a scrap of conversation that almost made her laugh. 2 privates were comparing scars. "One from shrapnel," one said, tapping his shoulder. "One from the doc stealing my blood for some poor bastard on the table." "The one on the table make it?" the other asked. "Yeah," the first said, almost proud. "So I figure that's 1.5 lives I get to brag about when I'm old." "You're not old enough to brag yet," the second said. "Tell that to my veins," the first shot back. They laughed. Not happy laughter, but alive. After the war, when someone finally wrote it down for real, it didn't sound like any of that. In a medical journal, thick with equations and polite language, a researcher summarized years of improvisation in one tidy paragraph. "Experience in recent campaigns has demonstrated the safety and effectiveness of frontline fresh whole blood transfusions using pre-screened donor panels, walking blood banks, in forward surgical hospitals. This practice significantly reduced mortality in cases of severe hemorrhagic shock, where stored blood was unavailable or insufficient. There were tables of survival rates before and after, charts with bars and error margins, footnotes citing field data from various theaters. In the footnotes, there was no line that said, 'Data compiled by a lieutenant who got tired of hearing dog tags hit a bucket.' There was no mention of late-night rosters, or color dots dabbed onto tags with stolen paint, or sergeants banging on mess hall tables yelling, "Walk, don't run, the nurse needs your pints." There was, somewhere in the acknowledgments, a vague nod to the initiative of frontline medical personnel. That was as close as she ever came to being on the record. By then, it didn't matter. The idea was out of her hands. In Korea, they formalized walking blood banks as standard. In later wars, helicopters moved casualties faster, refrigerators got better, but the basic principle stayed pinned to the wall of every trauma unit. If you can't get blood from a bottle, you get it from the people who have some to spare. Decades later, in a clean, bright hospital far from Salerno, a young doctor would stand at the foot of a bed, calling for ONEG donors over an intercom during a mass casualty event. And someone would mention, in passing, they did this first in World War II. Intense. Called it a walking blood bank. He'd nod, half listening, watching the monitors. He'd never know about Carter. He'd never smell burned canvas, or hear the sound of tags in a bucket, or see a nurse in a dirty uniform staring at 3 full tanks and 1 empty boy. He'd just know that when he lifted his head and said, "Who here feels like saving someone's life?" enough people stepped forward to tilt the graph one more notch toward survival. If you had to put it on a video thumbnail decades after the fact, someone might write how one field nurse's insane blood bank idea cut frontline deaths by 60%. Emily Ward would have rolled her eyes at the word insane. To her, it had never been madness. It had been arithmetic, and a refusal to accept that "we've done what we can" meant we've done what the manual says.